Well, welcome everyone to our Thursday afternoon seminar. Before I introduce our speaker, I just want to review the etiquette. So all audience participants are muted throughout the seminar. Please do not attempt to turn on your video or share your screen during the talk. And there will be an opportunity for the audience to ask questions live at the end of the talk, just like in a normal seminar. Once the speaker has finished his talk, you can use Zoom's raise hand feature to notify the meeting host that you would like to ask the speaker a question. They'll then unmute you and you can ask your question. And for those of you that have not been on Zoom all semester, that raise hand feature is located under the participant tab at the top of the Zoom window. So now that that review's over, it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker this week, Dr. Elliott Hazen. Dr. Hazen received his master's degree from the University of Washington and his PhD from Duke University. He is currently a research ecologist at NOAA Southwest Fisheries Science Center in Monterey, and he's also adjunct faculty at UC Santa Cruz, Duke, and Stanford University. His general research interests fall in the realm of ecology and ecological modeling, often addressing questions pertaining to predator-prey relationships, scale, and oceanographic forcing. In his research, he uses a combination of technologies such as fisheries acoustics, biologging tags, and oceanographic data with spatial statistics to tease apart ocean, climate, and trophic effects on marine ecosystems. A few examples of his areas of research include species ecology, movement and distribution, foraging theory and behavior, climate variability and change, conservation biology, and it sounds like a little bit what he's going to talk about today is ecosystem-based management. He's published over 130 papers on a diversity of topics, and he serves on many advisory boards and committees, such as the California Ocean Protection Council and Pacific Fishery Management Council Ecosystem Work Group. And with that, I will pass it off to Elliott so he can talk to us about dynamic oceans and ecosystems.
Thank you so much, Geeta, and thank you all for attending on a Thursday afternoon. It's at least sunny here in Monterey Bay, but I really like to start with this video, and if you've seen one of my talks, I apologize, you probably have seen them both before, but because it's showing an image of, or a video of sea surface temperature on the left, and a migrating north-south through the Southern California current on the right, just to highlight that we live in a world where the ecosystems are dynamic, the animals that use the ecosystems are dynamic, and even people that rely on these ecosystems, such as for ecosystem services, also are dynamic, yet we're often stuck using a lot of static management approaches. So hopefully I'll convince you by the end of this that the more dynamic we can be, the more responsive we can be to ecosystem perturbation and change. So I'd like to start, if I can make it, there we go. Just give a quick intro, since we are part of Monterey Bay. This is, I am part of the Climate and Ecosystem Group that is a kind of joint effort between NOAA and UC Santa Cruz. And most of the work that I'm presenting today is not a result of me or alone in any way, shape, or form. So there's a lot of people in our group that deserve equal praise, if not more so. So just to give a quick intro and kind of a general who we are, then a little bit just about kind of what I do. Sorry, I'm having trouble advancing, but Geeta introduced this quickly, but I'd like to look at things like species kind of movement distribution. And this is an example from humpback whales in Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary, where I was modeling what drives, in terms of prey distribution, what drives whale likelihood of foraging. So you can see their likelihood of foraging in black, in whiter time, or actually foraging events in black, and whiter times when they're not foraging, relative to dense patches of prey in red. I also looked at this, instead of looking horizontally, looking vertically in the water column to see what kind of trade-offs exist between oxygen stores, breath holding, and foraging when a blue whale is deciding how many lunges to take on a patch of prey. This was 2015 paper. So a lot of the foraging theory is really why I got involved in marine science to begin with. Then climate variability and change, how we can use a lot of our understanding of the ecological relationships to predict which species are likely to gain or lose based on climate change into the future, at least gain or lose in terms of habitat in this example. But then lastly, and really a lot of what I do on a daily basis now is this kind of applied ecology and management. So this is an example from the Gulf of Mexico, where we were modeling spawning grounds of bluefin tuna relative to the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. So the goal here was to actually calculate how many square miles of tuna habitat were oiled for the NERDA case, the case against BP essentially. So all of these approaches use a lot of the same kind of statistical tools, but they can be used to kind of get different inference out of them. So just to give a little bit of reason why we care, why these tools are important, and why static management may not be the end all be all, I'd like to talk about the example of the North Atlantic right whale. So on the left, you can see a map of the calving grounds to feeding grounds where it migrates from the coast of Florida and Georgia up to the Gulf of Maine to feed every year. And it was really a conservation success story. In 1980, there were less than 100 individuals critically endangered, still critically endangered today, but you can see the recovery trajectory. Unfortunately, in 2015, there was a large change in oceanographic conditions in their prey, and they basically started foraging in a relatively new habitat to them, at least new in terms of our data sets. And what that meant is all of the management approaches that were put into place in the Gulf of Maine were not necessarily present in this new foraging ground. And the news was, for good reason, since there were 18 whales that died, was pretty essentially harsh, pretty pessimistic about the future of the Maine lobster industry and these North Atlantic right whales. That's not just a problem that occurs on the East Coast, though, so I wanted to talk about one off of our shores as well. This is the Whale Entanglement reports from 1982 to 2017, and you can see in a very similar, actually, time scale, there was a huge spike in 2015 when whale entanglements right off of our coast. So working with a number of scientists up and down the coast, we kind of performed a CSI. We were lucky to have so much environmental data and even data on these top predators off of our coast. I can tell a bit of the story as at least to why we believe this has happened. So there was a persistent marine heat wave. Again, this is called the blob. It's in some ways actually still been forms of it persisting currently. The waters are still pretty warm off of our coast, but the 2015-16 was unusually warm from near shore to offshore, even more so than some of the large El Niños of past years. So this persistent marine heat wave resulted in things like a record harmful algal bloom. And this domoic acid actually delayed the start of the Dungeness crab fishery. So there are a number of different ecosystem components affected, shown by the McCabe paper on the right. But it also, this delay in the Dungeness crab fishery meant that when it opened, it was in direct timing with when whales were foraging off of our coast. Another important point was the prey distributions. These years, 2013 through 16, you can see how, particularly in 15 and 16, there was an increase in these red points, an increase in anchovy near Monterey Bay. And at the same time, there was low krill density off shelf. So what this meant is you had a high concentration of fish prey for those fish foraging whales and a low concentration of krill offshore, essentially resulting in humpback whales prey switching, along with recovering whale populations. We are in a situation where the humpback whales off our coast are kind of expanding to probably previously used niches, but new niches to us. So because of this, you got this unusual space-time overlap and a high number of foraging humpback whales that were getting entangled with crab pots and lines. So there's another just good example how a lot of the traditional management approaches can fail when there's a new overlap between animals and risk in the environment. So I also want to just give a quick kind of intro into a recent paper that talks a little bit about how top predators can be useful to us, not just as charismatic megafauna, but also to understand how environment is changing. And so there's a lot of data we can collect from top predators, either via putting tags on them in the case of leatherback sea turtles in the top right, or the elephant seal in the bottom right, but also new technologies like drones are allowing us to understand how big blue whales are, which is probably telling us something about what they're assimilating from the ecosystem and whether it is a good krill year or a bad year if we can collect these data kind of more holistically. So I think hopefully, again, by the end of this talk, I'll have you convinced that top predators are important, not just for management purposes, but also to understand kind of how ecosystems respond to climate variability. Tag data is also increasing in conservation. So this is not new to a lot of the folks probably on this call, but traditionally within particularly fisheries management, we rely on independent survey and fisheries data to get an idea of how many species are out there. But a lot of these telemetry data allows us to understand movement patterns, understand residency patterns, and just understand generally behavior from the eye of a predator to get a better idea of how we can design conservation strategies that match with these ongoing migrations and new migrations with climate variability and change. So another semi-recent paper Sarah Maxwell put out was a really nice analysis, taking a lot of habitat data from top predators and these telemetry tags to map where habitat was up and down the West Coast, an example of A, and then used risk layers that were published by Ben Halpern and his group up and down the coast to come up with these kind of impact hotspots on the rightmost side. So you can kind of see where these impacts, a lot of them are close to shore, close to where there's high density of humans in the water. Again, no huge surprise there, but this was a really good way of showing how you can put together habitat and human uses to get a better idea for where species are most likely to be affected. But this is also just a static picture, right? This is a one-time risk layer we had and a 10-year data set on predators that we used to create the habitat. So the recent approach that we've been trying to push and trying to take more and more often is this concept of dynamic ocean management. And this is a management approach that uses near real-time data to guide distribution of commercial activities. A number of these approaches were reviewed in Becca Lewison's paper in Bioscience, but it also has to change in response to the shifting nature of the ocean, both in space and time. So either by integrating new biological data or new oceanographic data that then updates the models and again informs the public and managers. And the goal of this is to essentially help divide on finer timescales the risks and the opportunities to support the sustainable use of marine resources in the ocean. So I'll talk through a number of examples of this, and then at the end, hopefully have a few time for some questions too, if anyone has any. So one of the inspirations, in some ways kind of the godfather to the dynamic ocean management world, was this tool called Turtle Watch. And so this was kind of led by Evan Howell in the Pacific Island Fisheries Science Center, where they tagged over 70 juvenile loggerhead sea turtles and also looked at fisheries interaction data. And the reason being is if there were approximately 30 turtles caught in the Hawaii longline fishery, it could actually shut down the fishery, resulting in a large amount of lost revenue. So the goal was, could we use the temperature preferences of the turtles and come up with a map shown in the bottom left of where turtles are most likely to be. So as one of our late colleagues, Dave Foley, called them, this is the happy turtle waters, where the turtles were most likely to be between 63.5 and 65.5 Fahrenheit, and areas to essentially suggest that fishers avoid to reduce interactions with loggerhead sea turtles and still be able to catch the swordfish that they were targeting. And the other exciting part about this is it was recently expanded in collaboration with Scott Benson and folks to include leatherback sea turtles as well. So now it's not just a single species tool, but it's a multi-species tool to understand where both loggerheads and leatherbacks are most likely to have interactions with the Hawaii longline fishery. So then, similar naming, we developed a tool called Whale Watch, which was a similar kind of approach, but instead of looking at kind of fisheries bycatch risk, we were interested in ship strike risk. So could we create, and it was really a first time effort on this, but near real-time models for dynamic movement patterns of blue whales in the North Pacific using 104 archival satellite tags that Bruce Mate and Oregon State put out, along with real-time environmental data on things like sea surface temperature, chlorophyll, upwelling via winds, and similar like that. And the impetus behind this was we knew that ship traffic, this is a map on the left showing just vessel count per square kilometer coming in and out of particularly the ports of San Francisco and Long Beach, had very high overlap rates with a lot of the hotspots of blue whale foraging off of our coast. So because we know blue whales are moving up and down the coast pretty regularly, is there an opportunity here? Could we find an opportunity for finer scale temporal management? Again, to allow for shipping, but also reduce ship strike risk kind of in real time. The other reason, the driver behind this, it came also from Jared Santora's work, is that we know is that these areas are also very high krill hotspots. And frankly, if we could measure krill on daily timescales and really understand their kind of patterns and processes, we could probably do a very holistic job managing for a number of predators in the California current. But simply put, it's a lot easier in some ways to observe whales than it is to, again, map krill at a ecosystem-wide scale and again, in fine time steps. So based on that, we combine the satellite telemetry data with remotely sensed oceanographic data to create these models, and then try to assist management efforts to mitigate against human impacts such as ship strike risk for the entire year. And the other nice thing about this model is we're now trying to work with offering our predictions of blue whales towards the Dungeness crab fishery to see if we can reduce risk of entanglement as well. So even though it was targeted towards ship strike risk, we're trying to explore to see if it could be useful for other risks as well. And it's important, Jessica Redfern's paper kind of outlines how there are these one formal channel between the Santa Barbara Islands and Santa Barbara itself, sorry, the Channel Islands and Santa Barbara itself. And there's also these kind of central shipping lane that's not official, but is often used, particularly by vessels that are trying to get around the clean air requirements that are necessary to go through the channel. So one of the things we know about blue whales, largely thanks to the Tagging Pacific Predators Project and work by, as I mentioned, Bruce Mate and Don Calabacitas as well, is that they have this very strong seasonal movement from north to south in the California current. So you can see them off the coast of California in the autumn and summer, and then migrating south to breeding habitat off Costa Rica Dome and Windsor, and spraying back up through Baja Peninsula and repeating this pattern each year. A lot of questions whether it's driven by temperature alone in the bottom right, or if it's a kind of long-term tracking of chlorophyll patterns. And the nice thing about some of our species distribution models is we can include both of these variables to try to see which ones are driving these blue whale migrations. So what we did is we first applied a state space switching model, which allows you to basically come up with the best possible track using area locations and estimated positioning for these blue whales, and then sampled and examined the environmental correlates. So at each presence point, we sampled things like temperature, shown here on the right, but also we had to simulate where whales could have gone to understand where they didn't go. So on the top right is an example of a pseudo absence. So in red is a potential track they could have taken out of 100 other potential tracks that was used as absence data to allow this comparison of where they went versus where they didn't. And then we built habitat preference models using both generalized additive mixed models and boosted regression trees. So just to give a quick insight into how a GAM, or generalized additive mixed model, works, you can see a response curve there on the left where you have some response. In this case, it's blue whale habitat likelihood. So values greater than 0 on the y-axis are saying there's an increased likelihood of blue whales being present, and less than 0, a decreased likelihood, as a function of log chlorophyll on the x-axis. So these, again, ecological relationships can then also be used to predict in real time where the whales are most likely to be. And these near real-time predictions of habitat, we also use survey data from the Southwest Fisheries Science Center in collaboration with Karen Forney and Elizabeth Becker to validate and say, how good a job are we doing recreating blue whale hotspots from environmental correlates alone. So these are our original 2017 whale watch predictions. One of the things we learned is that due to just simply cloudiness, we couldn't get much finer than monthly scale because chlorophyll data just was not available synoptically throughout the California current otherwise. But nonetheless, we were able to recreate these seasonal migrations using our model. So that was kind of a good first heuristic that we're doing something right in modeling their distribution. Initially, when we compare this with sightings data, there were some areas where it performed quite well. Particularly if you look in September 2008, there was a lot of presence predicted near shore, which is also was shown along with transect lines. But then there's other times where some of these offshore, particularly in August and October, are less predicted. And it really highlighted to us that the tagged whales were probably a different kind of subpopulation from those that are largely being sighted by ships, just highlighting the need for integrating multiple data sets and data types to best understand a whole, if you want to understand the entire population. Another important part of this that was concerning from the beginning was this high predictions off of Washington up onto Vancouver Island, because this was not an area that blue whales were traditionally sighted, at least not nearly as much as the Southern California Bight, but a lot of both calibration, or I should say corroboration, with Cascadia sightings data and historical whaling records showed that there have been, and there still are, large numbers of blue whales off the coast of Washington all the way up into British Columbia. And so this is just one of those examples where we might be expected, with increased population sizes of blue whales in the future, hopefully, to have kind of a recolonization of some of this northern habitat. They may just not have a need to migrate that far north if there's not competition for resources further south. So an interesting kind of caveat, or at least something to be aware of when using these species distribution models. The next step, Brianna Abrams, who's one of our alums from the lab and now is at University of Washington, starting a tenure track professor job, but she refit these models to UC Santa Cruz ROMS, a regional ocean modeling system, at daily time steps. So what that allows us to do is go from quarter degree and monthly to now daily and 1/10 of a degree predictions at much higher resolution, much more relevant, again, for the scales of conservation. So it's a really nice evolution of kind of this modeling framework. The other thing you'll notice, the AUC value shown here is a perfect model in terms of predicting presences and absences would be an AUC value of 1. So we did a pretty good job in our original whale watch model getting a value of 0.86, but Brianna's model of 0.95 definitely outperformed and is doing a much better job predicting where the whales are in real time. So the other cool aspect of this is you can take those data and then correspond or essentially put them with things like real-time AIS data for shipping vessels. And this is work of Hannah Blondin, who's a PhD student at Stanford University. And she looked at how these habitat changes and risk vary annually. And one of the things hopefully that's pretty noticeable is 2015, the same warm blob year, you can see a much steeper kind of, or not steeper, but a much larger shoulder to the beginning of the year, essentially stating that there were likely to be blue whales present earlier in the year due to the warm waters. And this was also reflected in the average risk on the bottom panel. And this is basically panels G and K just corresponding. At the same time, looking annually at these differences in, again, vessel activity on the top, blue whale probability in the center, and then the average weighted risk on the bottom. If you were to look even finer scales, such as daily, you could see that the cargo vessels, you got many more hits, many more AIS positions during the middle of the day than at nighttime. So even if you're looking on a daily time step, you might be missing some of the opportunities for separating risk and habitat that you could achieve if you were able to drop down to hourly or diel approaches. The other neat thing about this is the whale watch data, they're entirely public. So all of our predictions are hosted in near real time. This is the efforts that Heather Welch in our group is doing. And those real-time predictions then are ingested into the WhaleSafe app here. That gives both our predictions as the background, it gives AIS data, as you can see from the track lines, opportunistic sighting and aerial survey data for whales are shown with the fluke patterns there. And then there's actually a hydrophone as well in the southern part of the channel that was put out by Mark Baumgartner and Anna Surovich. So all of these tools can then be put together to get kind of more of a comprehensive whale nowcast system to understand where whales are in the Southern California Bight. Now to one of the more recent applications of dynamic ocean management is this EcoCast tool. And this is one was hot off the presses about 2 years ago, but it's still evolving. So I think it's still a useful example to talk about. And the goal of EcoCast was to develop a tool using logbook or observer data, opportunistic sightings if possible, telemetry data, and put all these together with fisheries economics, risk, weighted management concern from both fishers and the management agencies, and then have an ability to serve this back to the stakeholders in near real time. And as I talk through it, a number of these items have, I won't say have dropped off, but we weren't able to do steps 1 through 4 all in the first few years of this project. So we're still working on the simulations of fisheries economics and risk. So I'm not going to talk too much about those today. But EcoCast was created for the California West Coast swordfish fishery that uses a drift gillnet targeting swordfish, but does have interactions with things like California sea lions, blue sharks are actually one of the higher catch rates in this fishery, along with mola mola, and then very occasionally leatherback sea turtles as well. And so the goal of this, or I should say the management that had been applied to the drift gillnet fishery after some initial pingers were put on in the late 90s to reduce actually interactions with beaked whales that were largely successful, there was also still a number of these kind of leatherback turtle bycatch events since 1990. And the regional office came up with this Pacific leatherback conservation area in green, 3 months of the year where the fishery was closed to reduce interactions due to these 25 effects. So it's a very large closure for a number of isolated events for a critically endangered species. So again, the question was, could we come up with kind of a finer scale management approach? And this approach was very successful. Bycatch rates dropped significantly in the fishery, but at large economic cost. In the late 90s, there were around 200 boats, but that's now declined to just a handful. I think we're in the single digits now of California swordfish fishing boats left using drift gill nets. So for EcoCast, we use telemetry data and observer data both. And part of the reason for this is there simply aren't enough leatherback sea turtle records to create a model from 25 events. So we've used telemetry data from Scott Benson's lab for leatherbacks, sea lion telemetry from Dan Costa, and blue shark telemetry from Heidi Dewar, along with observer data on blue sharks and observer data on California swordfish. We use a lot of the same environmental data we explored for whale watch, but things like temperature, sea surface height, chlorophyll A, and then we put those into these species distribution models, again, creating these correlations between where the species are most likely to be and the environmental layers. But then the advantage, again, once you created this, is you can then use the environmental data and the statistical relationship to predict habitat, again, in near real time. So these predicted habitat suitability maps are then taken and shown here for just about 5 months in 2012. So you see swordfish on the left from the observer data, if you remember, California sea lions from telemetry data, leatherback sea turtles from telemetry data, blue shark from tracking telemetry data, and then blue sharks from the observer data on the right. So one of the encouraging parts looking at these individual species predictions is we're not seeing huge jumps in space or time, day to day. And that becomes important from a management context because you don't want to have a closed area one day that immediately opens and then closes the next day just because a vessel can't take advantage of it in that time frame. So it was encouraging that there was some persistence basically to our predictions. So once you have these individual species predictions, you then put them together using this integrated fishing suitability approach. And what we started with was an algebraic, very simple algebraic model where we multiplied each of the layers by the corresponding risk weighting. And this risk weighting was developed in partnership with the managers and the fishers in understanding which species they were most concerned with. So if we zoom in on this, you'll see for the kind of default scenario, leatherbacks are given a weighting of -0.9. And I should have also been explicit, the swordfish are also included, the target species are included directly with a positive weighting of 0.9 as well. So what this means is something like a sea lion actually is about 1/20th or 1/18th as important in this model as a leatherback sea turtle in coming up with these EcoCast surfaces. And that becomes important because you can adjust these values throughout the year if management priorities change due to either environmental conditions or, again, new information from the fishery. So this product now, I'm showing a map from 2012 where you have blue are areas that are high swordfish likelihood, but low likelihood of the bycatch species, again, based on these weightings. And areas of red are areas of high bycatch risk and low likelihood of target catch. In 2012, you can see there's a number of mesoscale eddies and similar offshore features in kind of orangish red in the Southern California bight. But generally, again, there's a pretty good persistence throughout the season. When we take that 2015, the blob year again as kind of a sample study period, hopefully it's pretty apparent that the patterns were actually quite different. Bycatch risk was a lot higher close to shore in 2015, and a lot of those mesoscale features were kind of swamped by the warmer oceans, the warmer waters offshore. So the goal here is to just try to make the case that a static approach when you have such a dynamic environment and dynamic use of the environment by these various species may not be the most successful. So the other nice thing, one of my other kind of federal job hats that I wear is working on the California Current Integrated Ecosystem Assessment. And those are really interested with this concept of indicators to look at time series of change relative to long-term means. And we can use these models to basically calculate percent available habitat and turn essentially the EcoCast components into indicators. And one of the things that can be really useful for is seeing that fishing late in the year, for example, November to December in 2015, may have been optimal for these focal species, except sea lions, where you see a slight increase in 2015, which is a dashed line. So you're basically looking for the areas where swordfish have the highest values and the bycatch species have the lowest values for those given years. So that's where one of these other ways of kind of a dynamic management approach, even if not implemented as a mandatory measure, can still be used to kind of assess environmental change on the ecosystem. And also highlights that difficulty again in managing across normal years and unusual years when we know these species use the environment quite differently. Just to put it another way, another thing we could do using EcoCast is calculate the number of days or the percentage of days that were predicted to be leatherback sea turtle habitat. And so if all 100% of the days of the fishing season were predicted to be habitat, you got the darkest green pixel in this example. And if 0 were predicted, you got a blue pixel. And what it shows in 2012 is that the PLCA, this large 3-month closure, actually captures about 80% of the habitat in a normal year. But on the right, 2015, there's a lot of bleed northward and a little bit of bleed even to the southeast of the PLCA, where leatherback habitat is predicted and is not necessarily protected by this large-scale closure. At the same time, there are some blue pixels within the PLCA that suggest maybe there would have been times where you could fish safely, avoiding leatherbacks and still targeting swordfish. So the goal being, can we, again, offer this information up to both fishers and managers in more real time, allowing to make these kind of finer scale decisions the same way you would if you're driving to work in a non-COVID year. You'd look at your Google Maps and see how bad the traffic jam might be in a given area and decide to go a different route. Same approach here again in dynamic ocean management. So not only can we use this for direct management advice, but there are efforts actually right now on the East Coast. Dan Creer and Toby Curtis and colleagues are using these dynamic models to evaluate the efficacy and timing of closures. And in their case, they're dealing with MPAs, just to say, are the MPAs actually protecting as many species, as many shark species as we intended them to do? So another important part about EcoCast and Whale Watch is they're not just a set it up and forget about it tool. There's a lot of work that gets done on the back end to essentially operationalize, to get the new biological data in step one, predict and create a final product as shown in the right for EcoCast. And then how do you disseminate this? So we actually have different dissemination pathways where we create the map product on the right. We have a Shiny app, again, that Heather Welch created, that is really useful if you want to dig into the different weightings and understand how those change the final output. And then also the public, a general website that describes why EcoCast was created and what these images mean. And then there has to be this automation where this is repeated at a prescribed temporal frequency as well. So you download the environmental data, use the species distribution models to predict, have the daily predicted habitat suitability that then informs your EcoCast final product. And so I recommend reading Heather Welch's Journal of Applied Ecology paper in 2018 to get a better idea for how this kind of operationalization step that is often not visible takes place. So in terms of next steps, we haven't stopped developing EcoCast. So similarly to Whale Watch, where we went from coarser predictions, quarter degree and monthly for Whale Watch, here we have quarter degree and daily for EcoCast. We're trying to use these regional ocean modeling system output, the ocean models, to do higher resolution predictions and get better kind of finer scale information for both the fishers that use the ocean and also the managers that have to decide when and where to kind of close the fishery. The other exciting thing about the regional ocean modeling system data is you get subsurface habitat metrics as well. So you can get an idea for thermocline depth or just mixed layer depth or different components that we know the animals are targeting that aren't otherwise available via satellite imagery. The other really exciting part about these models is by switching from satellite to the ROMS model, we are part of a broad team led by Mike Jaycox called Future Seas that is downscaling the Earth system models that we've used in the past to understand how species are likely to respond to climate change. So instead of having a full degree and kind of quarterly predictions from the Earth system models, the downscale ROMs are going to be at the exact same resolution, the kind of everyday potentially at 1/10 of a degree. So then we can say not just here's an outcast for where we think bycatch risk is greatest in red and fishing opportunity is greatest in blue, but we can tell you what is likely to be potentially tomorrow with seasonal forecasting, maybe next fall, and then with these long-term climate projections better out to 2100, which really helps people make decisions and determine if you're going to set up an MPA, it'd be nice to know if that MPA is likely to still have the same effect out into the future. And I've included a lot of these websites in case anyone is interested in digging deeper in any of these components too. Another important point is that the California swordfish fishery also faced increased management hard caps actually. So where if there were any number of protected species or marine mammal species that were identified caught in a given year, it could shut the fishery down. So one of the things we did is we partnered with Elizabeth Becker and Karen Forney to bring in some of their survey-based models into the approach to try to say, can we include humpback whales and Rizzo's dolphins in Pacific white-sided to inform our model and, instead of looking at 4 species, look at up to 10 species potentially for EcoCast. The downside for that simply was that every time you add a new species to the tool, you lose efficacy if you're really concerned mostly with leatherback sea turtles. So it's that trade-off of, do you really want a single or 2 species management tool versus a 10 species management tool that tries to kind of make the best situation out of a whole suite of species. And the other exciting part is we're not just expecting EcoCast to live on the West Coast. We're trying to find new applications and new opportunities to implement it as well. So with collaborators at in the Azores, actually, the University of the Azores, we're building this tool, AzoresCast. And one of the exciting things, for my mind, sitting in a government agency, is here in the US, we divide up ocean activities based on different kind of management structures. So shipping is largely managed by IMO, the International Maritime Organization, whereas fishing is managed by NIMS, sanctuaries are by NOS. But in the Azores, they have a regional government that basically manages it all. So it's really exciting about AzoresCast is it has the ability to not just be a fisheries tool, but it could actually be an ecosystem-based management tool for multiple species to kind of promote the sustainable blue economy. At the same time, I'm part of a team called Facet that's been dubbed Facet, where taking the lessons learned from EcoCast and really trying to go to this multi-scale prediction. So where you have environmental data, you have dynamic predictor layers for models, species of observations, vessel data from VMS or AIS data, to then create these predictions at real-time forecast and kind of future scale to understand where species interactions and fisheries interactions are likely to exist now and change into the future. So these are both kind of ongoing projects, so keep tuned for more to come, hopefully in the near future. So with that, I will start my wrap up and just give a few quick conclusions. Telemetry data, hopefully again, I've convinced you, can be very useful in predicting distribution and even density in the case of whale watch, which I didn't get too much into. But of these highly migratory species in near real time. And this is important because I think this also opens the door for other data sets, things like citizen science, such as iNaturalist or eBird, to be used in a lot of these same sort of dynamic management approaches. We shouldn't just be reliant on the data sets that we're most familiar with. And another approach, multi-species models, again, with a caveat that maybe not for 10, 15, 20 species, but these multi-species models offer the ability to maximize catch while minimizing bycatch. And they also can be dynamically adjusted as human uses and in-season risk weightings change. So this is not a tool that is meant to replace marine protected areas or supplant a lot of our traditional management approaches, but it's hopefully to be another tool in the toolbox where we can, particularly when targeting these species that we know are more ephemeral in the environment and are likely to face new risks in a changing climate. And for that reason, these dynamic ocean management approaches can offer a climate-ready management approach because they are creating a better match between ecological processes, the ocean, and human activities in both space and time. So one of the questions is, how do we build climate-ready management strategies or portfolios? And I think having a number of these kind of dynamic, readily updated approaches can allow us to do that. So with that, I know I finished a little quicker than I expected, but I'll close on this. This is a just overview of some of the tools on the left, then some of the papers that describe the pieces that went into those tools, and lastly, on the right, some of the actual code that went into developing these tools, because I think also can be very useful, hopefully, for transferring these kind of approaches to other ecosystems and other species of interest. So with that, hopefully, there's some time for questions. I'd be happy to answer some.
All right, looks like we have a question from Jim Harvey, so I'm going to go ahead and unmute him.
Great. Thanks, Elliot. That was great. Really appreciate it. I have a ton of questions, but I'll just ask one or two right now. One of them is, if you were to be asked which data sets are the most important, whether it's the animal tracking data or the environmental data, which one would you try to define or refine a little bit better? And then the second question basically is, as you alluded to at the end, these animals are reacting more to the prey than they are to the environmental signal that you guys are measuring. So it seems to me that there's a lot of effort that needs to be done with prey modeling to make sure that we're getting maybe a more accurate measure of what the animals are responding to.
Yep. And so on the first one, my answer honestly would just be it depends. I don't think it's easy to say that one is better than the other. We get into this chicken and the egg a bit with a lot of the leatherback sea turtle models that inform EcoCast, for example, because when you present this model, it looks like great, we're done. Here's the predictions. They'll go out 10 years into the future. But if you're not collecting additional tracking data or additional data on leatherbacks, you can't test the model to make sure they're still working in the way you expect them to, or in the way that you want them to. So I really think that, in terms of development for the satellite data, we need to make sure we're maintaining those, Earth observations from space. But at the same time, I think that telemetry data continued collection is increasingly important, because a lot of times the animals will respond and tell us they're responding to the environment well before we as scientists would recognize that from the satellite data alone. So, I mean, it's a really difficult to say which one is kind of more important to dig into, if that makes sense. The second question, in terms of the prey, I completely agree. This is something I think Dan Pendleton just had a paper come out from the East Coast that showed that really solid prey models did a better job predicting bowhead whale distribution than did the environment alone. The tricky thing, particularly for all the work that's been done on blue whales, we know that something as simple as just abundance of krill isn't what actually matters to them. They care a lot more about patch density, patch size, patch distribution, patch persistence as well. And those different characteristics are incredibly difficult to model, particularly at the scales that we would need for management. So that's where, if we can get to that step where we can say, hey, we're expecting there to be a really high persistence of krill patches in this area, that would be incredibly useful for management. But I think we're still a good ways away, unfortunately, from that off the West Coast, particularly given how dynamic the Pacific is compared to the processes that go on in the Atlantic.
Yeah. Well, so nobody else has raised their hand yet that I can see. So let me ask one more question then. So as you know, probably dealing with the fisheries themselves, they don't really want to be able to, or not, they're not capable of changing their path to their workplace as easily as you described, kind of in the analogy of going to work and seeing a Google map and going, oh, I can't go that direction because it's all booked up, but I'll go a different way. So they like to have resources available to them, or being told how they're going to fish a year in advance, right? So it seems to me that a lot of these models are going to have to go to the point, if they're going to be used by the fishery in a real way, they need to go to a point where they're really predicting a year in advance where things are going to be. Do you think we'll ever get to that point, given the dynamics of the system?
Yeah, so that's exactly, we have two funded projects that Mike Jaycox is leading both of those right now. One on seasonal forecasts out to about a year, and then also on the climate projections. And there's a really nice review paper by Alistair Hobday that highlights those different scales of decision making, like you say. And in some cases, the 10-year scale might be really important, because if you're a fisherman, you might want to decide, do I upgrade my boat this year, or do I think I'm likely to have enough money to kind of maintain a higher kind of fishing portfolio out into the future? So those longer term projections would be useful for that. Like you're saying, the annual projections would be really useful in which permits do I invest in, in a given year, or which fisheries do I want to try to partake in, for a given year. At the same time, a weekly prediction might be equally important, just to say, in the now term, here's where we think the fish are, but in a week, this is how we think it's likely to change. Because a lot of the fishing trips for swordfish are about a week long. So that would be a time scale where they could adapt and say, okay, well, if in a week this hotspot's likely to disappear and the one over here is more likely to persist throughout my fishing trip, I might target that instead. So, I did give the Google Map analogy. In this case, I also like to give the NOAA weather analogy, where it's a lot nicer to not just say, is it raining outside right now, but to be able to say, is it raining outside now? Is it likely to be raining this afternoon? Is it likely to be raining next week? So I can decide whether I'm going to do a road trip, again, pre-COVID times, or is it going to be raining next year? So I can decide how to kind of invest in maybe my backyard garden, or even more of the crops, that I might want to plant. So I mean, it's a great point. I hope we can get to the stage where we're offering these multiple scales of prediction to help inform the decision-making process.
Great. Thanks, Elliott. Great talk.
You bet. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks, Jim.
All right, next up we have a question from Alex.
Hi, yeah, this was a fantastic talk. Thank you so much for giving us this talk. I've got a whole bunch of questions, but I think what I'll start with is I see generalized additive models and generalized additive mixed models and boosted regression trees in the same sentence a lot. And I've never really understood the pros and cons of each method, or like in what situations you'd want to use one over the other. So if you have any insight, I would very much appreciate it.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's a really good review from Jane Elith back in 2006 that actually outlines a number of these approaches, but unfortunately that was before boosted regression trees were invented by Jane Elith. But the short answer is, so the simplest modeling approach, right, is the linear model. And so all of these up through GAMs are simply extensions of getting more and more allowance for nonlinearity in the processes. So the advantage of a GAM is you're still kind of basically using a parametric model. It's called a semi-parametric approach. So a lot of your relationships are going to be smooth. A lot of relationships are going to be closer to linear than nonlinear. There are ways to change that based on how many degrees of freedom you give it. So a lot of times GAMs offer a lot more interpretability, I would say, and they also offer a lot more of kind of the more traditional statistical hypothesis testing. Boosted regression trees and things like also random forest, machine learning approaches as well, those take a lot more the Amazon approach of, if you shop for this item, our models tell you you're likely to like this item as well. So they're using a lot of different kind of variance partitioning techniques to come up with the most parsimonious solution. And so for boosted regression trees, one of the reasons we've been moving more and more towards them, the first is simply that by incorporating multiple variables in this boosted approach, that you can get an idea of, if one variable is missing out of your 10 predictor variables, a boosted regression tree will still allow you to predict for that gap. So that's one of the reasons why we've been able to go from a monthly scale for GAMs and Whale Watch 1.0 to boosted regression trees, satellite data at a daily scale for EcoCast, if that makes sense. The other big part though is both, I think both GAMs, the further you get from a linear model, the easier it is to overfit your data. So there's a lot more kind of attention has to be you have to pay a lot more attention to how biologically or ecologically realistic is your model. So if you fit in the model and you get great AUC values, great statistics, does it then also predict where the animals actually are? Because those things actually can, just simply due to the machine learning powers, you can actually get really good predictive skill, but then the maps don't look at all like what these species actually use. I know that sounds kind of strange, but there've been some really interesting studies that kind of show how that overfitting process tends to go. So we use boosted regression trees more and more in a lot of our management applications because they are so flexible. They get around a lot of the traditional limitations of frequentist statistics, but they come with a catch that they're a lot more difficult to interpret and a lot easier to kind of overextend into unrealistic predictions. I hope that helps, because that was a very short description of a complex topic.
That did help, thank you.
All right, and we have one more question from Scott.
Hey, Elliott, Scott Schaefer, great stuff. I just had a question for you regarding what you see coming down the pipe in terms of advances in the remote sensing data. It seems like we're still using a lot of the same products, sea surface temperature and chlorophyll and sea surface height, but do you see any new products coming down the pipe and or new sensors that improve the quality and or the frequency of, well, I guess the frequency would be a little harder, but in terms of just, advances in the satellite remote sensing stuff that you can use down the road?
Yeah, and there's a few. There's been some on the analysis side and some more on the kind of the operational or the sensor side. So one of the traditional tools we've used for chlorophyll, the MODIS sensor, is actually, I think, now 8 or 9 years past its shelf life, maybe even more than that. And so they've launched a new sensor, the VIRS, VIIRS. And so that allows, and I would say largely we're investing more in continuity than truly new development. One counterpoint to that is I know there's a number of folks, not a ton, but a number of folks within NOAA that are pushing for a geostationary ocean color satellite. And that would allow you to deal better with these cloudy skies. So you'd be able to get multiple samples throughout a day to get a better idea kind of what's happening on the ocean color space. And the other thing they're doing is they're including often more bands. So, you know, the chlorophyll algorithm uses multiple different wavelengths of light to get an idea for what kind of chlorophyll density is in the water. But by adding more bands, the hope is you can get a better estimate of what's chlorophyll versus dissolved organic matter, et cetera. On more the analysis side, there's a lot more being done kind of on the mesoscale. So there have been, you know, great studies for seabirds, in particular on Lagrangian coherent structures, which is using sea surface height maps and tracking particles either forward or backward in time, usually backward, to understand where these kind of ridges are in the ocean that can serve to kind of aggregate or dissipate prey. Potentially. So those Lagrangian coherent structures, we're finding a lot more significance of. Brianna Abrams has a cool paper relative to elephant seals that shows that they're likely important in their foraging. And then Kylie Scales has a really cool paper that shows the LCS are likely also really important for bycatch in this drift gillnet fishery too, in understanding those patterns. So a lot of these different, you know, analysis tools. So we're using the sea surface height that we've had for a while, but we're analyzing it in a different way. And by we, it's not me at all. I'm an end user only, but the scientists are analyzing it different ways to get kind of new metrics. The other one I'm hoping will get a lot more development in the near term is a lot of the eddy detecting and eddy tracking algorithms, because we know that like not all eddies operate equally or have equal effect on the ecosystem. So age of eddy, length of eddy, cyclonic versus anti-cyclonic, all can have different kind of ecological response. So the more we can get on how the eddies are forming, how long they've been within the ecosystem, and look at those effects, I think will help us also, you know, kind of moving forward. I think, you know, I guess maybe this is coming back to Jim's original question about the telemetry versus satellite. I think there's a lot more effort, a lot more growth area in downsizing tags, getting smaller tags, tagging more individuals, and even doing things like putting solar loggers on them so you can have longer tag lives as well. That will help us get more tags out there and get a better understanding of how the animals are responding, because that's the 2019 paper I showed at the beginning on top predators, climate sentinels, really makes that point that we simply, until we have good data on prey at the scales we need, we're going to be relying on a lot of these charismatic species that can hold tags to tell us about how ecosystem is responding to climate variability and change.
Cool, thanks.
You bet.
Well, thank you very much, Elliott. That was a great talk. I don't see any more hands up. So at this point, unless there's any last minute questions, thank you very much for giving a great presentation and showing up on a Thursday afternoon also. And I don't think we're having a happy hour today. At least I haven't heard of any updates about one. So but thank you very much.
Well, thank you all. Yeah, thank you all for listening, and hope to see you guys in person in the not too distant future.